The colony ship Cradle of Orion was never supposed to die like this. It came apart in silence at first, the way all things break in the vacuum of space. No sound, no warning, just a sudden and terrible wrongness as the FTL drive mistranslated and ripped the vessel's spine in two above a planet nobody had bothered to name properly. Verath 4, the star charts called it, and next to that name in every Galactic Union database was a simple warning in red letters: Class 7 Death World, do not land. The life pods fired in sequence, hundreds of them, scattering like seeds thrown into the dark, and the nearby Galactic Union patrol fleet moved quickly to scoop them up, because colony ships carried families, and families meant political trouble if they were left to drift. They saved most of them. They counted the pods, and matched them to the passenger manifest, and found that all but one had been recovered, and that one pod, a single occupant emergency shell designed for a child, had already entered the atmosphere of Verath 4, and punched through the cloud layer and vanished into the southern continent. The patrol fleet commander looked at the data, and looked at the planet classification, and made a note in his log. Pod 77C, single occupant, age 7 Terran Standard, female, name Marin Voss, presumed deceased, recovery not cost viable. He closed the file and moved on, because that was the sensible thing to do, and the Galactic Union was nothing if not sensible. 7-year-old Marin Voss was not dead. She was, however, very close to it. The pod had done its job, mostly, absorbing the worst of the impact and wrapping her in crash foam that hardened around her body like a second skin. But the landing had still been savage, and the foam had cracked in 3 places, and her left arm was bleeding, and her ears were ringing with a sound like a bell that would not stop. She lay in the broken pod for a long time, breathing the strange air that leaked in through the fractured hull, and it smelled like mushrooms and copper and something sweet she could not name. When she finally crawled out, pushing through the shattered hatch with her good arm, she fell onto ground that was soft and damp and covered in something that glowed. The jungle of Verath 4 was not green. It was blue and violet and pale gold, a forest of towering fungal structures that rose like cathedral pillars into a sky she could barely see through the canopy. And everything was bioluminescent, pulsing with soft light that made the whole world look like it was breathing. Marin stood in the middle of it, 7 years old, bleeding, clutching a broken emergency beacon that blinked once and then went dark forever. And she did the only thing a 7-year-old could do. She cried. She cried for a long time, standing in the alien glow, with her broken arm held against her chest. Her the way a hunter listens to wounded prey, with patience and with interest. Something moved in the undergrowth. Marin did not hear it at first because she was crying too hard. But then a branch cracked somewhere to her left, and she went very still, the way children do when they sense something large and close and unknown. It came out of the fungal thicket slowly, not because it was cautious, but because it wanted her to see it. And what she saw made her breath stop in her throat. It was the size of a large dog, but built like a nightmare had tried to design a weapon, and then covered it in coarse dark fur, low to the ground, wide across the shoulders, with claws that looked like they were made for tearing open the world itself. And its face was broad and flat, and scarred with old wounds that had healed white against the dark fur. A radal. The Galactic Union had a file on radals that was 200 pages long, and the summary at the top said only this: Terran origin apex predator, gene drifted across multiple colony worlds, threat level crimson, do not engage under any circumstances. They were descendants of Earth's honey badgers, carried across the stars on old colony ships as pest control, and then released or escaped on 100 different worlds. and on every single one of those worlds they had done what honey badgers have always done. They had refused to die, they had refused to be afraid, and they had become the most dangerous thing in whatever ecosystem was foolish enough to contain them. This one was old and enormous, and it looked at Marin with small dark eyes that held no fear, and no mercy, and no hesitation. It growled, a sound that started somewhere deep in its chest, and rolled out like distant thunder, and every other sound in the jungle stopped. Marin should have run. Any adult would have run, or frozen, or screamed, or done any of the 1,000 things that prey animals do when they meet a predator that outclasses them in every way. But Marin was 7, and she was hurt, and she was alone, and she had just lost everything she knew, and something in her small and terrified brain made a decision that no survival manual would ever recommend. She reached out her hand. It was shaking badly, and her fingers were smeared with her own blood, and she had no idea what she was doing. But she reached out toward the creature that could have taken her arm off at the shoulder without even trying. The rattle stopped growling. It stared at her hand for a long moment, then at her face, then back at her hand. It stepped forward and pressed its broad, scarred nose against her palm, and sniffed, once, twice, 3 times, taking in the smell of her blood, and her fear, and her strange alien skin. Then it did something that would have made every xenobiologist in the Galactic Union lose their minds. It circled her, twice, slowly, pressing its flank against her legs, the way a guard dog circles its charge, and then it lay down between her and the jungle, and rested its heavy head on its paws, and watched the tree line, with those small dark eyes that feared nothing in the universe. Marin looked down at the creature. The creature looked up at her. She did not understand what had just happened, and she would not understand it for years, but something old and deep and wordless had passed between them, something that had nothing to do with species or biology or the cold logic of survival. She was alone, and she was small, and she was hurt, and this thing, this scarred and terrible thing, had looked at her and seen something worth protecting. Marin lowered herself to the ground, slowly, carefully, and leaned her back against the creature's warm flank, and the rattle did not move, did not growl, did not even twitch. It just breathed, slow and steady, and the warmth of it seeped into her bones. From every direction, 1,000 eyes and 1,000 hungers pressing against the edges of the clearing, but nothing came closer. Nothing dared. Marin closed her eyes, and for the first time since the ship had broken apart above her, she slept. The fungal forest pulsed its soft blue light around them like a heartbeat, and the rattle kept watch through the long alien night, and somewhere far above them in the cold safety of orbit, the Galactic Union had already forgotten that Marin Voss had ever existed. That was their first mistake. She named the rattle on the 3rd day because she needed something to call it when she talked to it. And she talked to it constantly because it was the only thing on the planet that did not want to eat her. She called it Sable because its fur was dark as night, except where the scars ran white across its hide. And because the word felt sharp in her mouth, the way the creature itself was sharp in every possible way. Sable did not care what she called it. Sable cared about 3 things: eating, fighting, and making sure the small, loud creature that followed it everywhere did not get killed before morning. The first year was the hardest, because Marin was still soft in the way that all humans are soft when they have not yet been shaped by the world that holds them. And Verath 4 was a world that shaped things with teeth and poison and starvation. She learned to eat by watching Sable. Whatever Sable ate, she ate, and whatever Sable avoided, she avoided. This simple rule kept her alive through the first terrible months when everything she touched seemed designed to kill her. The fungal growths that covered every surface came in 1,000 varieties, and she learned them one by one, sometimes by observation, and sometimes by pain. Because there is no teacher quite as effective as spending 2 days vomiting after eating the wrong mushroom. By the end of the first year, she knew which ones were food, and which ones were medicine, and which ones would stop your heart in 30 seconds. She was 8 years old when she made her first kill. A stalker lizard had come for Sable in the night, a creature built like a snake that had been given legs and a jaw full of backward curving teeth. And it had caught Sable off guard for the first and only time because Sable was injured from a territorial fight with something even bigger. The lizard had its jaws locked on Sable's hind leg and was trying to drag the rattle into the sea. Undergrowth, and Sable was fighting with everything it had, but the lizard was longer and heavier, and its grip would not break. Marin did not think. She grabbed the bone shard she had been using to dig roots, a broken piece of something's rib that she had ground to a point on a rock, and she threw herself onto the lizard's head and drove the shard into its eye. The lizard thrashed and screamed, and Marin screamed louder, and she did not stop stabbing because she could not stop, because if she stopped, the thing would turn on her, and she would die, and Sable would die, and she would be alone again, and she could not be alone again. She stabbed until the lizard stopped moving, and then she stabbed it 3 more times, because she was 8, and she was terrified, and she did not know it was already dead. Then she crawled off the carcass and vomited into the moss, and then she sat down and cried for a very long time. Sable limped over to her and pressed its nose against her cheek and made a sound that was not quite a growl and not quite a purr, and Marin wrapped her arms around the Raytel's thick neck and held on until the shaking stopped. That night she ate the lizard, because Sable ate the lizard, and because she was hungry, and because on Verath 4 you did not waste a kill. She was 9 when she discovered the poison garden, a grove of pale yellow fungal blooms that grew in the deep shade of the canopy, and the spores they released could paralyze anything that breathed them in, locking every muscle rigid for hours, while the fungus slowly began to digest the victim alive. Marin found this out by accidentally walking through a patch and spending 4 hours frozen on the jungle floor, unable to move, unable to scream, watching through locked open eyes as something with too many legs crept closer and closer before Sable arrived and tore it apart. After that she did not avoid the poison garden. She studied it, learned to hold her breath and harvest the blooms with her face wrapped in layers of fungal fiber. And she learned to crush them into a paste and coat her bone blades with it. And the first time she used a poisoned blade on a predator and watched it lock up mid-lunge and crash to the ground like a fallen tree, she laughed out loud. It was not a kind laugh. She was 10 when the other rattles began to come. They arrived one by one, drawn by something, territory, curiosity, or perhaps the strange reality that Sable's range had become the safest and most productive hunting ground on the continent, because Sable's range had a human in it, and the human was making it better. Marin did not try to tame them because you cannot tame a rattle, and she did not try to command them because rattles do not follow commands, but she offered them something they had never had before. She offered them a plan. Rattles were fearless and powerful, and nearly impossible to kill. They were not strategic. They fought everything head-on with raw fury, and that worked most of the time, but it was costly, and it was wasteful. Marin showed them another way. She set traps, deadfalls made from fungal timber, pit traps lined with paralytic spines, snare lines woven from fiber that was almost invisible in the blue glow of the forest, and she drove prey into them with noise and fire, and the rattles waited at the other end and finished what the trap started. It was not domestication. It was partnership, the same kind of partnership that had existed between humans and wolves on old Earth 100,000 years ago, two predators recognizing that together they were something more than either could be alone. By the time Marin was 10, she had a pack of 6 rattles, and she could bring down prey that outweighed her 100 times over. She was also forgetting how to be human. Her Terran standard, the language she had spoken with her parents, the language of bedtime stories and breakfast arguments, and all the small, soft things that made up a childhood, was fading, replaced by a growing vocabulary of growls and clicks and posture shifts that the rattles understood and responded to. She could still speak if she tried, could still form the words in her mouth, but they felt strange and distant, like a song she had heard a long time ago and could only half remember. She thought in Radel now. She dreamed in Radel. She was 11 years old when she stood on a ridge overlooking the biggest thing she had ever seen. A creature the size of a building, armored in plates of chitin that looked like they could stop a plasma bolt, moving through the valley below with the slow, terrible confidence of something that has never in its life been afraid. Anything else on the planet would have looked at that creature and turned away. Marin looked at Sable. Sable looked at her. Was not the grin of a little girl. It was the grin of something that had been forged in 4 years of blood and fungal light, and absolute refusal to die. A grin that showed teeth, and meant exactly what teeth have always meant. She raised her hand and made the sign, a quick, sharp gesture that she and the pack had developed together. And it meant something very simple. It meant go. The pack moved, 6 radals flowing down the ridge like dark water, silent and fast and utterly without fear. And Marin moved with them because she was pack, and the pack did not leave its own behind. Somewhere in orbit far above her, the Galactic Union's databases still listed her as presumed deceased. Somewhere in Terran space her father sat in a room full of unanswered messages and refused to believe it. And somewhere in the fungal deep of Verath 4, a girl who had once been afraid of the dark ran through a bioluminescent jungle with a pack of monsters at her heels. Afraid of anything anymore. She had forgotten how. Commander Tyle Vashari of the Galactic Union Military Research Division was not the kind of officer who tolerated surprises. He was Sithari, tall and cold-blooded in both the literal and the figurative sense, with silver-scaled skin and eyes like polished glass that never blinked more than twice a minute. And he had been given command of the Verath 4 expedition because he was efficient, and because efficient officers did not waste time on things like doubt or mercy. The mission was simple on paper. Verath 4's fauna was among the most dangerous in the catalogued galaxy, and the Galactic Union was fighting border wars on 3 fronts and losing 2 of them, and someone in military command had decided that if the universe was going to produce monsters, then the Union should learn how to put those monsters on a leash. Vashari's job was to survey, capture, and evaluate the weaponization potential of Verath 4's apex species. He arrived with 3 warships, 400 soldiers, a full complement of capture drones and suppression field generators, and neural net restraint systems, and the absolute certainty that nothing on a death world could challenge the organized might of the Galactic Union. He was wrong about that, but it would take him some time to understand how wrong. The problem started on the 2nd day. A capture team sent to tag and restrain a mid-tier predator in the southern continent walked into a deadfall trap, a weighted section of fungal timber rigged to drop from the canopy when a trigger line was disturbed, and 3 soldiers were pinned before they understood what had happened. Vashari reviewed the footage and dismissed it as a natural hazard, a falling branch, an unlucky coincidence. The next day, another team found a pit trap, dug into the soft ground and lined with sharpened stakes that had been coated in something that made every soldier who touched them lose feeling in their hands for 6 hours. Vashari did not dismiss that. Pit traps were not natural hazards. Pit traps were built, and built meant intelligence. and intelligence on an unsurveyed death world meant that someone had made a very serious error in the original planetary classification. He ordered a full thermal sweep of the southern continent, and the results came back strange. Dozens of Crimson-class Raytel signatures moving in patterns that looked less like animal migration and more like patrol routes, and among them, sometimes near them and sometimes ahead of them, a single small thermal signature that read as bipedal. Vashari stared at the data for a long time. "What is that?" he asked his chief analyst. The analyst ran the signature through every database they had and came back with an answer that made no sense. "It reads as human, Commander, a juvenile, approximately 11 standard years, but that cannot be correct, because there are no human settlements on Varith 4. No human can survive the southern continent." But Vashari was Sithari, and the Sithari did not waste time arguing with data, so he assembled a capture team. 20 soldiers, full suppression loadout, heavy restraints, rated for Crimson-class fauna, and sent them into the jungle. They found her in a clearing near a stream. She was crouched over the carcass of something large, cutting strips of meat with a blade made from bone, and she was covered from head to foot in streaks of bioluminescent fungal paste that made her glow faintly blue in the jungle's perpetual twilight. She was small, painfully small, with matted dark hair that hung past her shoulders, and skin that was brown from sun, and scarred from years of things that had tried to kill her and failed. And her eyes, when she looked up at the soldiers, were not the eyes of a child. They were the eyes of something that had been living in the dark for a very long time, and had learned to see perfectly. The squad leader raised his scanner, and the reading confirmed what the thermal sweep had suggested. Homo sapiens, female, age 11 Terran standard. And for a moment nobody moved, because nobody knew what to do with this information. Then the squad leader activated his communication link and reported to the ship. Vashari received the report in his command chair, and he leaned forward and looked at the video feed, and saw a small, filthy girl, crouching in alien mud, surrounded by the thermal signatures of 6 Crimson-class predators, and he processed this information with the cold efficiency that had made him a commander. "It is just a cub," he said, and his voice carried the particular contempt that the Sithari reserved for things they considered beneath their attention. "Seize it, and catalog the radals for the weapons program." The squad leader relayed the order, and 20 soldiers activated their restraint fields and began to close in on the clearing. From all sides, Marin watched them come. She did not understand their language, and she did not understand their technology, but she understood what 20 predators closing in from all directions meant, because she had seen it 1,000 times in the jungle, and it always meant the same thing. It meant they thought she was prey. She opened her mouth and screamed. It was not a scream of fear. It was a sound she had learned from 4 years of living with rattles, a sharp rising call that carried through the fungal canopy like a blade through silk, and it meant one thing. Now, Sable hit the squad leader from the left side like a dark missile, 100 pounds of muscle and fury and claws that could tear through body armor like wet paper, and the squad leader went down without making a sound, because you cannot make a sound when something has just driven the air out of your lungs. The other 5 rattles came from everywhere at once, from the canopy, from behind fungal pillars where they had been waiting with the patience of creatures that had never in their lives known what it felt like to be afraid. The suppression fields fired, and the rattles did not care. A suppression field works by overloading a creature's nervous system with pain, and pain is supposed to make things stop. But rattles had evolved on 100 different worlds by refusing to stop for anything, and a burst of pain was just one more thing they refused to stop for. 4 soldiers went down in the first 5 seconds. The rest broke formation and ran, because training only holds when the thing you are fighting behaves the way the training says it should, and nothing in any training manual had prepared them for 6 unkillable predators led by a feral human child who fought like she had been born in the dark. Vashari watched the footage from orbit. He watched the largest rattle, The one with the scars, the one the thermal data showed, was always closest to the child. Place itself between the retreating soldiers and the girl. And he watched it turn its broad, flat head toward the drone camera and growl. The growl was low and steady, and it did not sound like a threat. It sounded like a statement. Vashari's junior analyst was shaking when she pulled up the Galactic Union's ethological database and cross-referenced the rattle's posture and vocalization against known behavioral patterns. "It is a territorial and familial claim, Commander," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. The closest translation would be a declaration of ownership and protection. "In simple terms," Vashari said. The analyst swallowed. "It is saying that the human belongs to it, Commander. It is saying that is my human." The bridge was silent for a long moment. Vashari stood from his command chair and straightened his uniform and looked at the frozen image of the scarred rattle. Standing over a feral child on a world that should have killed her 4 years ago. "Deploy the full ground assault division," he said. "Full armament, full suppression, lethal force authorized against the fauna." "Commander," the analyst said carefully, "the child is a Terran national, if she is—" "The child is feral," Vashari said. "She is not a citizen, she is a specimen, and I will not have my expedition humiliated by an animal and its pet." He turned away from the screen and did not see his officers exchange glances behind his back. The kind of glances that officers exchange when they realize their commander has stopped making decisions and started making mistakes. But Vashari was already past the point of noticing such things. He had been embarrassed, and for a Safari commander, that was worse than being wounded, and he would burn the entire southern continent to ash before he admitted that a child and a pack of animals had made him look like a fool. That was his second mistake. His first had been thinking that a human, even a small one, even a young one, even one that was just a cub, was something you could simply seize. Vashari sent 200 soldiers into the southern jungle on the morning of the third day, and by nightfall, 40 of them had not come back. He told himself this was acceptable, because death worlds were dangerous and losses were expected. But he knew, somewhere beneath the cold Sithari logic that had carried him through 30 years of military service, that the jungle was not what was killing his soldiers. The girl was killing his soldiers. Not directly, not with her own hands, though she was certainly capable of that too, but with something far more dangerous than a bone knife coated in paralytic spore paste. She was killing them with planning. The first column to push into the deep jungle hit a tripwire made of fungal fiber that was nearly invisible in the blue bioluminescent glow, and the wire did not trigger a trap. It triggered a stampede, because the wire was connected to a series of noisemakers that Marin had hung in the territory of a nesting mega predator. And the sound drove the creature into a rage, and the creature drove itself into the column. 12 soldiers were injured before the creature was brought down, and by the time they had reorganized themselves and pushed forward again, the Raidles had already taken their supply cache. The second column tried a different approach, moving through the canopy on hovering transport platforms that kept them above the jungle floor, and that worked well for about 2 hours, until the platforms began to malfunction, because something had chewed through the power conduits during the night, while the platforms were docked. Raidle teeth, the engineers confirmed, and the teeth marks were precise, targeted at exactly the components that would cause the most disruption with the least effort, and that meant someone had studied the platforms and figured out where they were weakest. Marin had spent 3 nights watching the GU camp from the canopy above, close enough to hear the hum of their generators, memorizing the shapes of their machines, and the routines of their guards, and the locations of their supply stores. She did not understand the technology, but she understood patterns and weaknesses the same way she understood the patterns and weaknesses of every predator on the continent. Because a machine was just another kind of animal, and every animal had a place where it was soft. The third column never even made it into the deep jungle, because Marin detonated a chain of cultivated spore pods along the only navigable path. She had spent 3 days preparing them, harvesting the pale yellow blooms from her poison garden, and packing them into sealed fungal husks, and stringing them along the path at head height. And when the column moved through, she triggered them with a single thrown rock, and the air turned gold with psychoactive spores. The soldiers began to hallucinate within minutes. Some of them saw their own comrades, enemies, and opened fire. Some of them saw the jungle itself coming alive, and ran screaming into the undergrowth, where things with real teeth were waiting. And some of them simply sat down and stared at nothing, while the spores rewrote the signals in their brains. The rattles moved through the chaos like shadows, picking off the isolated and the confused, with the cold efficiency of predators who had been hunting in coordination with a human for 4 years, and had gotten very, very good at it. Vashari watched the footage, and for the first time something cold and unfamiliar moved through his chest, and it took him a moment to recognize it as fear. He was not afraid of the child. He was afraid of what the child meant, because if a single human juvenile could do this after 4 years on a death world, and what could a trained adult do? What could a squad of trained adults do? And he understood suddenly, and with terrible clarity, why the rest of the galaxy was so nervous about the Terran Republic. But admitting fear was not something a Sithari commander did, so he buried it and doubled down. He sent the mechwalkers. They were the pride of the GU ground forces, 3-story armored platforms that moved on articulated legs and carried enough firepower to level a city block. And they were supposed to be invincible against anything short of orbital bombardment. The first mechwalker made it 2 kilometers into the jungle before it stepped into a pit trap that Marin had spent a week digging. The pit was not deep enough to swallow the machine, but it was deep enough to jam one of its legs. And when the pilot tried to wrench free, the fungal timber that lined the pit crumbled, and the leg sank deeper, and the machine tilted, and that was when Sable attacked. Sable came in from above, dropping from a fungal pillar onto the mech's sensor array, the cluster of cameras and thermal readers mounted on its head, and the Ratel tore through the sensor housing with claws that had been sharpened on Verath 4's stone for 11 years. The mechwalker was blind in 3 seconds. The pilot panicked and fired weapons in every direction and hit nothing but jungle. And the machine staggered and lurched, and Sable rode it the entire time, tearing deeper into the housing, ripping out cables and conduits, with the methodical fury of a creature that did not understand the concept of giving up. The mech toppled sideways into the fungal canopy with a crash that shook the ground for a kilometer in every direction. Sable limped away from the wreckage, with a new scar across its shoulder, and a piece of sensor cable still hanging from its jaws. The mech did not get up. That was the night the communications officer broke. His name was Tail, and he was young, and he had joined the GU military because he believed in the mission, and he had watched 3 days of footage that showed his own forces being systematically dismantled by an 11-year-old girl and a pack of animals, and he could not reconcile what he was seeing with what his commanders were telling him. So he did something that would end his military career, and possibly save a child's life. He copied the combat footage, all of it, every angle, every engagement, every moment of the rattles tearing through suppression fields and the girl moving through the canopy like a ghost, and he uploaded it to an open Galactic Union datanet with a single caption: "She is 11 years old, and we are trying to kill her." The galaxy saw it within hours. The footage spread across every network and every world and every species that had access to a data terminal. And the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. because there is something universal about watching a child fight for survival, and something universally horrifying about watching an army hunt that child down. The Terran Republic saw it. 2. They saw a human girl, a Terran citizen, a child who had been logged as dead and abandoned on a death world by the same Galactic Union that was now trying to capture her like an animal. And the reaction from Terran space was not horror. It was rage. Quiet, focused, diplomatic rage, the most dangerous kind. But Vashari did not know about the broadcast yet, because he was in his command chair, staring at the wreckage of his mech walker and the crater where his reputation used to be, and he was making one more decision. "Prepare an orbital strike on the southern continent," he said. His weapons officer turned to look at him with an expression that was not quite disbelief and not quite refusal, but was somewhere in between. "Commander, the southern continent is 400,000 square kilometers of—" "I am aware of the size," Vashari said. "Prepare the strike." The bridge crew moved slowly, reluctantly, entering commands with hands that did not want to obey, and Vashari stood at the center of it all, with his glass eyes fixed on the planet below, and his mind fixed on the simple, terrible logic that if he could not capture what was down there, then he would burn it. He never got the chance. A proximity alarm screamed across the bridge, and every screen lit up with the signature of a ship dropping out of FTL directly above them. A big ship, a Terran ship, and its hull was painted with the diplomatic colors of the Terran Republic, and its name was broadcast on every frequency. TDS Moral High Ground. On the bridge of that ship, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, and his jaw set in a line that had not relaxed in 4 years, was Ambassador Kale Marin Voss, Marin's father. He had received the broadcast footage 19 hours ago, and he had commandeered a diplomatic cruiser within the hour, because he had spent 4 years fighting to get someone, anyone, to go back to Vareth 4 and look for his daughter. And now he had proof that she was alive, and he was not going to waste a single second more. He opened a channel to Vashari's flagship, and his voice was calm and steady, and carried the weight of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Commander Vashari, this is Ambassador Kale Marin Voss of the Terran Republic. You are engaged in hostile military action against a Terran citizen, and I am ordering you to stand down immediately, or this becomes an act of war." Vashari stared at the screen. The orbital strike command blinked on his console, waiting for confirmation. He did not press it. Not yet. The standoff above Vareth 4 lasted 6 hours, and during those 6 hours, the entire galaxy held its breath. Commander Vashari stood on his bridge with the orbital strike still blinking on his console, and Ambassador Kale Marin Voss stood on his bridge with a diplomatic fleet at his back. And between them was a planet where a girl and a pack of rattles waited in a jungle that glowed like a dying star. The argument was not really about the girl. It was about what the girl meant. Vashari argued that Marin Voss was no longer a Terran citizen because she was no longer functionally human. That 4 years on a death world had turned her into something feral and unrecoverable, a creature of Vareth 4 rather than a daughter of Earth, and that the Galactic Union had jurisdiction over death world fauna and everything on it. Kale argued that his daughter was alive, and that a living Terran citizen does not stop being a citizen because the Galactic Union failed to rescue her, and that every second of combat footage showed a child using intelligence and strategy and compassion, human traits, every one of them, and that if the GU wanted to claim she was not human, then the Terran Republic would be very interested in having that argument in front of every court and every camera in the galaxy. The diplomatic channel burned with cold fury on both sides, but it was Vashari who was losing, because the leaked footage had already done its damage. Every world with a data terminal had seen an 11-year-old girl outsmart a professional military force, and every world with a heart had seen a scarred and terrible Ratel stand between that girl and harm, and refuse to move. And public opinion was not something a Sithari commander could fight with suppression fields and mech walkers. The Shari's own officers were turning against him, quietly, in the way that military officers turn when they realize that their commander has led them into a disaster. End careers, and the weapons officer who had been ordered to prepare the orbital strike had developed a sudden and very convenient system malfunction that prevented the firing sequence from completing. Vashari was alone on a bridge full of people who would no longer follow him, and he knew it. But he would not stand down, because standing down meant admitting he had been wrong, and a Sithari commander would rather burn than be wrong. It was Kale who broke the deadlock. He did it by doing something that no diplomat in the history of the Galactic Union had ever done, something so reckless and so human that Vashari could not even process it as a tactical decision. He went down, alone, unarmed. He took a single shuttle from the moral high ground and flew it through the atmosphere of a Class 7 death world, and landed it in a clearing on the southern continent, and stepped out into the bioluminescent jungle with nothing but his clothes and his voice, and the desperate, terrified hope that his daughter was still in there somewhere behind the scars and the fungal paint and the bone weapons. The GU forces tracked him by satellite, and so did the Terran fleet, and so did every news network that had managed to tap into the military feeds, and the galaxy watched a single unarmed man walk into one of the most dangerous places in the known universe to find his child. He walked for 3 hours. The jungle should have killed him a dozen times over, but it did not, because the path he followed was clean. No traps, no tripwires, no deadfalls, no spore pods, and he understood what that meant, even though he could not see who had cleared it. She was watching him. She had been watching since his shuttle broke through the clouds, because she had learned to watch everything that entered her territory. And she had seen this shuttle come in slow and gentle, not like the military ships that came in fast and hard, and she had seen a single figure step out of it and begin to walk, and something about the way the figure moved had made her chest hurt in a way she did not understand. She had cleared the path without knowing why. Kale found her in a clearing by a stream where the fungal pillars grew so tall they disappeared into the canopy above, and the light was soft and blue and gold, and the air smelled like copper and rain. She was standing in the center of the clearing, with a bone knife in each hand, and her body was tense and coiled and ready to fight or run, and she was covered in scars and fungal paste, and her hair was a wild dark tangle, and her eyes were sharp and bright and full of something that was not quite fear and not quite recognition. Around her, in the shadows at the edge of the clearing, 6 rattles watched with dark eyes that reflected the bioluminescent glow. Sable stood directly in front of her, between her and the stranger, and the old rattle's body was low, and its shoulders were bowing wide, and the growl that came from its chest was a sound that said very clearly that nothing was getting past without a fight. Kale stopped walking. He looked at the rattle, and the rattle looked at him, and for a moment they simply regarded each other, 2 creatures that had nothing in common except that they both loved the same small, fierce person. Kale knelt. He did it slowly, carefully, lowering himself to the ground, the way you do when you're trying to show something dangerous, that you are not a threat. And he kept his hands open and visible, and he did not look away from Sable's eyes. "I know what you did," he said, and his voice cracked on the words, because he had rehearsed this moment for 4 years, and now that it was here he could barely speak. "I know what you are. I know you kept her alive. I know you fought for her and bled for her, and I know that she is yours as much as she is mine." Sable's growl did not stop, but it changed, shifted into something lower and less certain, because the creature was reading the man the way it read everything, by posture and scent and the subtle language of the body, and what it read was not aggression, it was gratitude. Kale bowed his head. It was a gesture that crossed every species barrier in the galaxy, a lowering of the most vulnerable part of the body, an act of trust so complete that it could not be faked, and he held it for a long moment, while the jungle breathed around them, and the Rattels watched from the shadows, and Marin stood behind Sable with her knives raised, and her heart hammering against her ribs. Sable studied the bowed head for what felt like a lifetime. Then the old Rattel stepped aside. It was not submission, and it was not surrender. It was permission, granted by one protector to another, and it was the most generous thing that Sable had ever done, because Sable had never in its life shared anything with anyone except the small creature it had. Claimed in a clearing 4 years ago, Kale raised his head and looked past Sable and saw his daughter for the first time in 4 years. She was so different and so changed that for a moment his brain could not connect this wild, scarred creature with the girl who had liked strawberry ice cream and bedtime stories, and who had once cried for an hour because she found a dead bird in the garden. But her eyes were the same. Her mother's eyes, dark and deep and full of a stubborn fire that no amount of Deathworld could extinguish. Marin, he said. The name hit her like a physical force. She flinched and her grip tightened on her knives, and something moved behind her eyes, something old and buried and painful. A memory of a voice saying that name in a warm room on a ship that no longer existed. She knew this word. She had carried it somewhere deep inside herself for 4 years, wrapped in the tattered remains of a language she had almost forgotten. And it had survived everything, the jungle and the monsters, and the hunger and the fear, and the long, lonely nights when she had pressed herself against Sable's flank and tried to remember what it felt like to be held by something that had hands. Marin, he said again, and this time his voice broke completely, and tears ran down his face, and he did not care because he had found her. She was alive. She was right here in front of him, and she was alive. A tear cut through the grime on her face. She did not sheathe the knives, but she took a step forward, and then another, and her legs were shaking, and her breath was coming in short, sharp gasps, and the rattles in the shadows shifted and stirred because they could feel her distress, and every instinct told them to protect her from whatever was causing it. Sable did not move. The old rattle watched with its dark, steady eyes, and it did not interfere, because it understood, in whatever way a rattle understands such things, that this was a pain that could not be fought. Marin stopped an arm's length from her father, and looked at him, and he looked at her, and the silence between them was so vast and so full that it seemed to have its own gravity. She opened her mouth. The word came out broken and rough, scraped raw by 4 years of disuse, barely recognizable as Terran standard, more growl than speech, but it was there. It was real. It was the most human sound on the entire planet. Dad, Kale Marin Voss, caught his daughter as her legs gave out, and held her, while she shook, and the knives fell from her hands, and clattered on the stone, and she buried her face in his shoulder, and made sounds that were not words in any language, but that meant the same thing in all of them. In orbit above them, Vashari watched the satellite feed, and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. His career was over, and he knew it, and for the first time in his life, he was not sure he cared. The aftermath unfolded with the slow, grinding inevitability of galactic politics. Vashari was recalled to Union Central and stripped of his rank, and his name became a word that other commanders use to describe the kind of failure that happens when arrogance meets something it does not understand. The Galactic Union was forced to reclassify Raidals from Crimson-class Deathworld fauna to Terran-allied sapient-adjacent species, a bureaucratic designation so awkward and so clearly forced that it delighted every human in the galaxy. The communications officer Tail, who had leaked the footage, was dishonorably discharged, and then immediately hired by the Terran Republic's diplomatic corps at 3 times his military salary. Marin returned to Terran space, but she refused to go without Sable, and when the diplomats tried to explain that a Crimson-class predator could not be brought aboard a civilian vessel, she looked at them with her wild, dark eyes, and said nothing. And Sable stood beside her, and also said nothing, and the diplomats reconsidered very quickly. There was a political battle over the Rattles that lasted 3 months, and involved 14 committees, and one incident where Sable bit a senator who had voted against granting the Rattles entry visas, and the senator later admitted that he probably deserved it. In the end, the Terran Republic granted Sable and 6 Rattles full legal residency status, the first non-sapient beings in galactic history to receive it. And the document was signed by the Terran president with a smile that suggested she had enjoyed the fight immensely. Marin never fully came back to the world she had been born into. She learned to speak Terran Standard again, but there was always a growl beneath her vowels, a roughness that no amount of speech therapy could smooth. And she slept on the floor beside Sable's bed because floors felt safer than the soft, elevated platforms that humans called mattresses. She was kind to children and gentle with animals, and she could walk into a room full of diplomats and make every single one of them feel slightly nervous without doing anything at all. Years later, she became the Terran Republic's first Death World ambassador, the diplomatic envoy sent to worlds too dangerous for anyone else, and she was very good at it, because there is no better diplomat than someone who has survived the worst the universe can offer, and come out the other side still capable of reaching out a hand. She never went anywhere alone. Sable walked beside her always, old now and silver-muzzled, and slower than it used to be, but still radiating the quiet absolute certainty of a creature that had never once in its entire life backed down from anything. And the galaxy learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, what Sable had known from the very first night in that bioluminescent clearing when a bleeding, terrified 7-year-old girl had reached out her hand, and a monster had chosen not to bite.